Cool. So yeah, this is me. I think I've said all of this already. I wanted to open with a fun fact that I used to be a competitive gamer when I was in college. This is not relevant whatsoever to the actual presentation, but I thought it's useful to. Yeah, I don't know how to close the slide panel. Does anyone know what button to press? If someone knows how to close the slide panel, that would be very useful. But I don't know how to use this software. We will proceed without, I think, clicking document. Amazing. Wow. Excellent. The power of collective intelligence. Cool. The game was Overwatch. Cool. So why did we write Europe 2031? So the authors all came together because we have a view that AI is going to be the most important technology of our time. And that if Europe doesn't get AI right, we risk losing our agency, we risk losing our sovereignty, and we risk losing our access. These are three different things, but they're really the same thing, and all connected in an important way. And there's this sort of common ground that no matter what you care about, no matter what your values are, you should value your agency to act over your values. And so then this makes AI quite important, and losing access and agency is something you should be worried about. This is the Gen Z translation of the scenario. Europe is cooked, it's so over, but it could be so back. We'll get into the how it could be back later, but we should start with a diagnosis of like, why is it so over? Why do we think Europe is in a really bad position? And so Europe 2031 is a 5-year story, starts in Jan 2025, ends in March 2031. And it's basically starting off the premise, three main premises. Premise one is that Europe has severely misjudged the speed at which AI is moving. 2 is that it's misjudged the scale of how big AI will be. And then 3 is it's misjudged its own ability to catch up. And through a combination of these 3 different mistakes, Europe ends up not realizing, or realizing too late, what is coming, and then not being well positioned to prepare. So how is the story told? We tell the story through 2 main characters. You have Caroline Dubois, who is a French policy worker in Brussels, and you have Christian Vogt, who's a German AI founder in Silicon Valley. I think these 2 characters are quite important in telling the story, because whenever you start your conversation with someone about, you want to tell them about this threat model, you want to tell them, and the TLDR is the US might restrict access to your frontier AI models. You start telling them, you say, AI is so big, AI is going to be important, and they look at you like you're Christian. And they say, you're just a tech pro from Silicon Valley. You don't know how government works. You don't know how all institutions work. The system can respond. The system is full of adults, and the system knows how to respond. And Carolyn is the adult in the room, and it's supposed to represent the system. And it's supposed to represent the fact that even if you are taking locally rational actions, the actions may not be rational for the system as a whole. And even though it might feel like you're doing the right thing locally, it might not be enough to actually prepare for what is to come. So I'll do a very brief summary of the scenario for those who haven't read it, but I don't think you get much value out of me reading through the scenario, so I'll mostly skim over it. There is some value we can talk about later. So scenario opens in 2025. We have DeepSeek and You Shall Find. This is sort of starting with this moment in Brussels in January 2025, where DeepSeek releases this new model. And everyone's update is basically, the American, I don't have a link to the slides. I can give that after, perhaps. Or if Claude is finished, not yet. Yeah, so Brussels' response to DeepSeek is, amazing. The Americans, their expensive closed models can simply be replicated by training a very cheap open model, and we don't have to worry about being so far behind. We're actually much closer than we are. Compute doesn't matter. A bunch of basically. Then in Paris, a few months later, you have this summit where billions of euros are announced, and sort of this is Europe's entry back into the AI race. Everything's like, we're so back. Things are, there is this air and sense that by announcing things, we are sort of relevant still, and we can sort of announce our sovereignty. But in reality, a lot of the announcements are just repackaged other funding and don't actually point towards where the bottlenecks are. And then finally, at like the end of 2025, you have this moment where GPT-5 comes out. People are like, it's a bubble, it's disappointing, AI isn't going to be this big thing. And so across 2025, you have this update in the wrong direction. And this is partly what contributes, along with many other things, to a quite bad starting position into 2026. Then across 2026, you sort of have this continuation of the scenario of people governing AI don't use AI, we don't have a lot of compute, and then you have, well, I guess this is updating this now. You have this moment in 2026, right around when the scenario comes out, where suddenly people wake up and they say, hang on a minute, AI is very important for sovereignty. Hang on a minute, America can restrict our access whenever they want to, sovereignty matters a lot. And so you have this like wake up and smell the coffee moment, and the remaining 4 years of the scenario really hinge on how Europe responds in 2026, how Europe responds to this moment where something big happens and they have to make an announcement. In the scenario, we predicted that the sort of shock would come a bit later. In practice, the shock was Fable 5 being released, and then the US government restricting Fable 5, and that came out 2 days after we published that scenario. But in general, I think the narrative structure still holds. So what does Europe do wrong in the scenario? Sovereignty backfires in a sense. So Europe's default response is to go all in sovereignty, but what they mean by sovereignty is essentially protectionism. It's saying we can do open models, we can preference European AI solutions, we need to really like lean into what makes Europe strong, and that is our domestic champions. And then why that ends up going wrong is the fact that frontier capabilities still matter. So what we wanted to do with the scenario is sort of distinguish the difference between capable pre-frontier and capable frontier. So you might have a lot of value being generated from your open source ecosystem, but there are some things where you need frontier capabilities, and in this case, it's cyber defenses. And so the European over-reliance on open models leaves them vulnerable to cyber attacks. Then in 2028, things are heating up between the US and China. They're in this sort of AI race, if you want to frame it as that, and Europe is sort of caught in between that. And the US is worried about ASML exporting its machines to China, and so basically shows up and says, hey, we would like to stop this. And Europe tries to respond, but they don't have enough coordination, they don't have enough leverage, they don't have the ability to stand up and be like, this is problematic. And so it sort of just happens without any reaction. Then in 2029, you're sort of getting into this position where compute supply worldwide is even more constrained than it is today. And so the US is so desperate for more compute that they basically start rationing access to frontier AI by country. And Europe lands in tier 2. And this isn't to say that America is sort of saying, Europe is bad, we hate you, we're going to punish you, but this is more just saying you're not important enough. We need to prioritize our own access, and then you get access, and you're not in tier 3, which is China and Russia, but also tier 2 doesn't really get much access anyway. And then what you can see play out is that because AI is so important for growth, you start to see a divergence. And so what little leverage Europe did have, it starts to lose out on more and starts to fall further and further behind. Then by 2031, you start to see this compound, you start to see economic effects start to kick in and spiral, and you get debt problems, you get unemployment problems, you get firms being outcompeted by more competitive firms from other countries. And this all ends in 2031, where you're basically left with a really shitty deal that you have to make. You're left with the US showing up and saying, hey, we will bail you out. We will give you access to AI. We will do this. But you are essentially going to be our puppet, or you're going to have to choose between handing over all your assets to China. And so the high level is that Europe is not really a victim in the strongest sense of the word from the future, but it's sort of just left on the sidelines and left to be irrelevant, and is just caught up in what is an adversarial dynamic between the US and China, and doesn't appear to have many options to do anything. So 2 days after we published this, Pete Hegseth decided to make us famous by banning Fable from foreign users. This is sort of relevant to what we were talking about. In practice, I don't think it is the exact failure mode that we were pointing at. But nonetheless, European politicians have interpreted as such, and at least interpreted as a warning shot for what might come. So how did the scenario do? I think these numbers are out of date. We've had 800,000 readers, and many public endorsements. These names, you might recognize some of them. So I think what you might not get by just me reading out the scenario and sort of saying this happens, this happens, this happens, what you might get if you want to read it or listen to it, if you haven't already, is the idea that, okay, at a certain point, the system isn't paying attention to the problem and thinks it isn't as important enough, and that's, is this better? There we go. You know, at a certain point, the system isn't awake and isn't paying attention to a problem. And that in and of itself is bad. But then at a later point, the system does wake up to the problem, but then its responses and its sort of instinctual directions are also wrong. And so it is not sufficient just to wake up the system. It is also necessary to hold the hand of the system and say, this is how you should understand this problem. This is when you need to act and how you need to act. Cool. Other things that are useful to say, it's a story. It's not like a PowerPoint presentation. It's not just like a list of like years and dates and like this happens, that happens, then that happens. What we wanted to do was have people engage with what we feel to be a plausible future in a very emotional way. And you know, I think that it has been successful in doing that. Many people have reached out and said, you know, I have a child. I don't want my child to grow up in the world that you describe. If you want people to feel the AGI in some sense, a story is perhaps the best medium to do that. Okay, what can we do? There are 5 main things Europe can do, we think, at least, to prevent the scenario from happening. Build compute and the supply chain beneath it or above it. Form a coalition of aligned middle powers. Reform AI, labor markets for AI adoption, lead the physical AI revolution, and offer a positive vision of AI for society. I could go into each of these. Do you think that would be useful, Jessica? Or do you think we should do questions about the first half and then do what we should do in questions about the second half?
I think maybe go through each of these and then we do like Q&A as a whole.
Okay, that makes sense. Cool. What's the best way to start with these? So I'll start with correlation. So some of the first responses that people have when you tell them the story is, okay, we really need access to frontier AI systems. This is really important. We need to build them ourselves. And unfortunately, I think we're in a position where we can't really do that. I would give it less than 10% chance that we have a domestic frontier capable company in Europe within the next like 3 years, maybe 5 years even. Now, like that's still like maybe a 10% chance, right? A lot of that 10% might come from taking moonshots, taking big bets. But there is like some systemic reasons that the last massive 7, 8 tech companies have all appeared in the US. It's not an accident, right? You can get lucky once, you don't get lucky 8 times in a row. And so you have to change a bunch of things. You have to make a bunch of reforms to make Europe competitive at that again. And then those reforms take a lot of time to trickle through. So you only really start to see the changes in 5 years' time. What you can do in the short term, sort of saying, okay, we know what to do in 5 years' time, is you can build up leverage and you can negotiate for access. So the idea is that Europe and other aligned middle powers may not be very important on AI individually, but collectively, they are quite important in lots of different places. So if we sort of like look through this slide, we sort of talk about a potential middle power coalition between select European countries like Netherlands, who has ASML, then like Germany makes the mirrors through Zeiss that ASML uses. France, Canada, Norway, they all have abundant energy resources you can use to build data centers, build compute. South Korea produce a lot of high bandwidth memory that goes into producing data centers and chips. Japan have a large supply of semiconductor manufacturing equipment. UK has a bunch of AI talent, has the AI Security Institute. So all of these places have individually some small relevance in the AI supply chain. The idea is that these leverage points might not be individually relevant, but might be collectively quite powerful. And so you can pull together a coalition of aligned middle powers, so to say, and pull your leverage to negotiate for what you want. Maybe what you want is access. Maybe eventually what you want is safer, more reliable AI. The idea is that you want to pull your leverage together so that you can negotiate for that. How do I go up? Okay, the problem is current leverage is not enough. Even if we pulled this all together, maybe it would be sufficient soon, but it probably won't be enough. So you need to build out a lot more leverage. The upstream AI supply chain, so data centers, the things that come above data centers, the energy supply, the chips that go in the data centers, the machines that make the chips that go in the data centers, the machines that make the machines that make the chips that go in the data centers. This is all a very incredibly concentrated supply chain. And so what you can do is if you can become important in that part of the supply chain, you can then exert some amount of leverage and sort of increase your importance. In particular, compute is a very low-hanging fruit to do this because whilst Europe only possesses 5% of global compute currently, to the US is 75% and soon 80%, total compute supply, I think, will triple in a few years. And so you could very easily turn that 5% into 20% if you made a few changes. So in general, for many countries, compute seems to be a very easy, so to say, way to increase your leverage on AI and become quite important. But not all countries might have abundant energy resources. Not all countries might have a functioning permitting system that allows you to build good connections. Excuse me, you should still try. But there might be other ways you do your comparative advantage. If you're the Netherlands, maybe you want to help ASML grow really big. However, if you're, let's actually go here first. If you're Germany, you might say, actually, I can't do anything in the short term. But what I can do is make sure I'm really well placed in the long term and say, physical AI, that's where it's going to be big. Maybe robotics, maybe fusion, maybe photonics. All of these new technologies that will come after AI, if you become important in those, like those still are very relevant and important, even if you get AGI or whatever. So countries can make a bunch of decisions now such that these things kick in maybe 5 years' time. And then they hold on to their relevance and they build up lots of nice leverage that they can use. Another thing countries can do is reform their labor markets. So historically, Europe's market size has been a big source of its leverage. Now, the problem is that Europe's market has already shrunk from something like 30% of world GDP to 20% of world GDP. And the gap between the US and the EU's market is continuing to grow. And so unless we adopt AI well, and we have the economic growth that it should bring, we risk economic irrelevance. And so labor markets are one place that many European countries could do a lot to enable R&D, enable new technology companies to grow, but also to just yield the broad-based economic growth that will give them long-term leverage. There's a model from Denmark that we think is quite good. It sort of gives you the best of both worlds in terms of protecting employees and labor protections, whilst also giving firms the flexibility they need to be adaptive and flexible with AI. And then finally, we think it's really important that you offer a positive vision. So it's quite a doomy scenario, but by default, voters are already not happy with AI, not happy currently, and no one's saying this is how your life is going to be better if we make these changes. No one's saying if we do X, then Y will happen, and you will be better off for Z reason. And so I don't blame the public for being pissed off with AI, and I don't. But unfortunately, even though I don't blame them, and people are justified to be angry or annoyed with AI, there's another group of people who are sitting in Washington, DC, who do not care about what you think and do not care about what Europeans think or other people in middle powers think. And so in some sense, we have to look at the big picture and say, what is it we care about and what do we need to do to deal with that? By default, things will look quite bad. I think it's a plausible scenario. However, it is still June 2026, and we have a lot we can do to change that. The sort of idea behind the scenario is to be an ideological flag that you wave in the air, right? Or like a flare that you shoot up, and everyone looks at that flare and they're like, "Whoa, that's really scary. I don't want that to happen. How can I help?" And many people have already reached out, and many people continue to do so. And so there's a lot people can do to help. And that's the end of the present. Oh, is it? Yes. Questions?